In the spirit of reconciliation, New South Wales State Archives acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connection to land, sea and community. We pay our respects to their elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. So just a little bit first about the convicts. Basically, they arrived in New South Wales between 1788 and 1842, roughly 80,000 of them. Disproportionate number of men and women, 85% to 15%. 2/3 English, which includes Scottish and Welsh, and 1/3 Irish. Sentences were usually 7 years, 10 years, 14 years or life, which was normally 21 years, but does mean life. After 1842, there's a small number of what are known as exiles who arrived. And exiles were those who'd served part of their sentence in England and were granted conditional pardons or tickets of leave on arrival. So where can you find information on our website? First of all, this Research A to Z section has good convict guides. It also has the online indexes, and we'll talk a bit more about one of those guides in a minute. And as well, all of our databases and indexes can be searched through our catalogue, through the collection search box. And some digital copies of some records are available, including the very early Convict Indents. We often get asked for information about convicts that we actually can't supply. So the question of why we can't supply it needs to be addressed first. And there are various changes in administrative arrangements for looking after the convicts. So between 1788 to 1826, it's the Colonial Secretary is the main department, and he was supported by the Superintendent of Convicts, but it's the Colonial Secretary who's responsible for the records. But from 1827 to 1855, the Principal Superintendent of Convicts is the one who runs the convict system and also has the records. 1855, the British government transfer responsibility for the convict establishments to the New South Wales government. From the 1st of January 1856, which is a period when there are fewer and fewer convicts, then it's the convict branch of the Inspector General of Police who's responsible. Now the point is that the records of the Principal Superintendent of Convicts were destroyed. There were 2 destructions, one in 1863 and one in 1870. There's various stories about this. The one where it was all sort of shipped out to sea and dumped off the heads is not true, and neither were these records destroyed in the Garden Palace fire in the 1880s. It was actually a reasoned, well thought of, they had reasons for doing what they did. Maybe we don't necessarily agree with those reasons now because we think the records are important. But there was a huge amount, a huge volume of material. You know, we're talking 4.1 tonnes went in 1863 and 5.1 tonnes or 27 cases in 1870. From the records that do exist, in 1863, it was probably the records relating to the convict hospitals and some other convict establishments such as the female factories at Newcastle and Parramatta that were destroyed. And those records were burnt. The 1870 inventory of convict records is sadder for us, but there's a huge amount of material there. It's 111 spare sets of printed indents. The black books, 21 black books, 21 court books, 1 white book, 46 ticket of leave passports, and most importantly for the questions that we're unable to answer, the assignment registers also went. Now all these records were pulped in 1870. The black books were a record of all prisoners convicted in the colony, and it was like a summary record. It stated their crimes, their sentences, and it had to be looked at whenever a convict was applying for a ticket of leave or permission to marry or whatever. They'd go back to the black book, they'd have a look and see what the behaviour of the person was. So these are also known as conduct registers, And we here in New South Wales are extremely envious of our Tasmanian cousins who still have their conduct registers and still have their assignment registers. Now, the loss of these records makes information harder to locate in New South Wales. Doesn't mean it's gone forever, it's just harder. So the Principal Superintendent of Convicts correspondence was destroyed, but he was writing to the Colonial Secretary, and those letters that he wrote still exist, and copies, the Colonial Secretary was writing back to him, and the Colonial Secretary kept copies of the letters that he wrote back to the Principal Superintendent of Convicts. If you want to read more about this, there's an article up on our website called Lost and Saved by Christine Shergold, which talks all about these kind of records. So here we have an example from a Tasmanian conduct record, and I'd like to thank one of our customers, Margaret, who pointed out to me the fact that if a New South Wales convict was sent to Tasmania, the Tasmanian records don't just have information on their time in Tasmania, they also have information on their time in New South Wales that has obviously been extracted from the New South Wales and possibly sent with the convict. So, for example, we learn that William Bryan arrived in Sydney on the 22nd of October 1839, sentenced life. He got 50 lashes in October 1840. In May 41, he got 50 lashes for being drunk. He absconded. July 42, he got 14 days in the cells. He was tried at Berrimah Quarter Sessions on the 24th of October 42 for having firearms in his possession. And he was committed to 14 years to a penal settlement. Now, New South Wales, Tasmania, we all operate under the British laws at this time. If the punishment under the British laws were transportation over the seas to a penal settlement, then he got sent from New South Wales to Tasmania, and for the offence of having the firearms in his possession. So this information has survived for some New South Wales convicts, but only if they were repeat offenders and got sent to Tasmania. How do you find out what information we have on convicts? Well, this is the homepage of our website, and basically there are a couple of places. You could enter the person's name into our search box, which you can see on the bottom of the screen. You can also go through the quick links, which is the third black box on top of the Sydney Harbour Bridge. You've got three things there. You've got the online indexes. You've got the Research A to Z section, which also has indexes, links to the indexes, plus guides, plus stories. And you can also access the webinars through that one as well. So when you go to the Research A to Z, you get a series of letters. Click on C for convicts. Click on the word convicts. And this is where you get the convict guides and the tabs for the indexes and stories. Now, we've put up the original paper copy of our convict guide as a PDF. You can download this or you can look at it on the web. And we would recommend having a good read of that because it really sets out in great detail exactly what kind of information we have. There may be, because it was published quite a while ago, there may be some slight changes, particularly in what has since been put up digitally on our website and on other people's websites, but still good information. So, for example, this is the table of contents, and you can see how it's divided up into the various parts of the convict experience and also some specific places. It shows up, talks about the background to the record, because it's always important to understand why the records were created, why the government wanted that record, and what legislation affected the creation of that record. So you've also got references to any indexes that are around, bearing in mind that there's a lot more now indexed than what appears in this guide, and also information on what records have survived. So now we're going to talk about the types of convict records and go through some of the examples of some of those. There may be other records that have survived, but these are the broad categories. So how do you know if you have convicts in the family? Often it's a marriage certificate or a death certificate. So the marriage, and again, only if these events occur while the person is still a convict. A marriage certificate is the dead giveaway if it says married with permission of the governor. And this indicates that one or both parties were actually still convicts serving their sentences. Bearing in mind that the convicts far outnumbered free settlers in the early years of the colony. A death certificate might also state prisoner of the Crown, but again, only if the person died while they were still serving their sentence. Other records, such as muster and census records, might say free by servitude, and that indicates that the person is an ex-convict. Family stories are important. There may be some sort of information in the family, that's some sort of memory that brings you back to this. My colleague Jeanette also suggests that some obituaries in newspapers, if they say an old colonial, and that's kind of sort of a guarded way of suggesting that the person was an old colonial or an old colonist, maybe a guarded way of suggesting that the person was a convict. So convict indents, this is basically the record of them having arrived. It's a list of the convicts transported to New South Wales on a particular ship, created in England before they are transported, usually organised. Some of them are organised by the name of the jail they came on. So some may be alphabetical, others aren't. And travels with the convicts on the ship, generally in a locked box, handed over to the authorities in New South Wales and then ticked off to say that they have arrived. The main thing is that the amount of information you're going to get from them varies over time. And the later ones can be much more detailed than the earlier ones. An indenture was a legal agreement, and basically it's a legal agreement between the person who is shipping the convicts and the British government. And the earliest indents actually start in 1786 because they were compiled before the first fleet came out. So you'll get name, age on some pre-1800 indents and from June 1813, but not for the people between 1800 and May 1813. When and where convicted, sentence. Now there is an index and digital copies of the very earliest convict indents up to 1800 available on our website. As I said, the government requirements of what they need changes through time, and therefore the records change through time. So from July 1814, as you get more and more people in the colony, and as people have finished serving their sentences, and some are still serving, some have finished, and you've got free people arriving, and so on and so forth, you start to get a need for more information in these records. So from July 1814, you've got native place, calling or occupation, and physical description. Now, I'm really certain that people who are descended from the First Fleet convicts would love to know what their convict looked like, but the records didn't require it because there were only a small number of people, and you could easily recognise that that was John Smith who arrived on this ship and had a 7-year sentence, and that other person was John Smith who arrived on ship number 2 and was here for life. But as the colony expands, there's a need for this physical description to be included. From 1826, you get the offence, former convictions, religion, marital status, family and education. And 1826 to 1832, you get how disposed of, which is basically the person that they may be assigned to. They also annotate and update these records, and you can see some of these, for example, are the ticket of leave number, the conditional or absolute pardon number may also be written on the record. Ancestry has digitised microfilm copies of these that we hold, and you'll find the convict indents on Ancestry, as well as on microfilm in our reading room and at major libraries such as the State Library and the National Library of Australia. There are 2 different types of indents. There's the bound manuscript indents, but as the colony expands, there's actually a need to have more than one set of these indents. So you need a set at the localities where the convicts are. So you get printed indents from 1830 to 1842. Here's a page from a volume of Convict Indents. It's for the Victoria, and the Victoria arrived on the 17th of January 1829, having left Devonport in England on the 1st of September 1828. Here we have a close-up of some of the information that you can get. So you get that 34-753 is potentially the ticket of leave. C39938 for Joseph Bilton is possibly the certificate of freedom. We get his age, his religion, whether he can read and write. Obviously, if you were bringing people out, they wanted to know if they could use them as clerks or whether or not they would just be labourers. Family, native place, trade or calling, offence, where tried. You get a physical description, and you also get a description of moles and scars and tattoos. And you get how they were disposed of. So he went to R.A. Rod at Newcastle. He was assigned to Rod. The next set of records are the assignment records. So on arrival, a convict was either retained by the government for work on public works or was assigned to an individual. And very few of the assignment records have survived. So have a look at our convict guide to see what's survived. And also, this is a place where you need to look at newspapers, government gazettes, and those sort of things. There is an index to assignment registers on our website, and the assignment registers themselves are available on Ancestry and on microfilm at our reading room and at major libraries, such as the State Library and the National Library. Now, for example, here we have Samuel Horner, who is being assigned to Jane Horner in 1824, possibly a husband being assigned to the wife, and it tells you the ship that he came on. Our next set of records are musters and census, and basically the difference is that a muster is a list of convicts, whereas a census includes free people, but not soldiers and their families. These could have been kept for different reasons. It could have been because they wanted to assess the land holdings, or they just wanted a head count of the population. But they give you that glimpse in time about where a person is residing, who they're employed by, and whether or not there might be family living with them. They start in 1880, continue through to 1837, but they are in different gappy time periods. So 1802, 1805 to 6, 1811, 1822, 23 to 25, the 1828 census, and the 1837 one, which is the last one. These are all available in printed form and may even be at a local library near you, as well as being available on Ancestry. And the 1828 census is actually now, the New South Wales version, I should say, of the 1828 census is actually digitised on our website. There's two versions, there's the British version and the New South Wales version. And this is part of a page from the alphabetical returns that's up on our website. So it's always a good idea to check what we've got listed against the book version of 1828 census, because the editors of that went through both versions. Marriage records, again, remembering that it's only going to be while they're still convict or ticket of leave. Actually, I should rephrase that, because a marriage, permission to marry, was an indulgence that was only given to ticket of leave convicts, and you didn't generally get married until after that. That's because once you were ticket of leave, you were supporting yourself, a bit like a parole, and therefore you could support a wife. If you get married, if you were applying to get married before you had your ticket of leave, basically you're either asking your master or the government to support your wife, which wasn't accepted in those days. There are Colonial Secretary's Papers. There's, of course, the Registry of Births, Deaths and Marriages online indexes, bearing in mind that's only church registers before 1856. There are the Colonial Secretary's Papers, the online index and digital copies on our website now, up to 1825. Convict Applications to Marry, an online index on our website, up to 1851. And there's the returns of applications for the publication of bans, 1826 to 1841. And there's an index to this held on microfiche in our reading room. So they record a huge amount of information and they are really, really great. And basically it only requires one of the parties to be a convict still serving their sentence. And often because there were so few women, women may not have yet got a ticket of leave, but they're allowed to get married. So it can link for you. Because it has both parties' names, it can link you to a person. So if you've got 25 William Kellys and you're trying to figure out which one of the 25 William Kellys was yours, if they've got a permission to marry, then you've got their ship name and you've got their partner's name and their partner's ship name. Now, these also include refusals, not just permissions, and that can be quite interesting. You know, obviously great-great-grandma wasn't the love of great-great-grandpa's life when he's actually applied to marry 3 other women before her. So here, for example, we have an example of a page from one of these permissions. William Hawthorne was 40, Hannah Donahue was only 20. She was still serving her sentence, but he was ticket of leave. George Manville was free, and he actually came free, and he is marrying Alice McNully, who is still serving her sentence. As I said, women tended still to be serving their sentences when they were permissions to marry. So questions really can't be answered, but what brought these couples together? Do the age differences reflect the imbalance between the males and the females, or was it pure love? There's also the returns of application for the publication of bans, and basically you'd have to announce in church on 3 successive Sundays that the marriage was taking place, and you would need official permission beforehand. And here, for example, we have some examples. So John Bluck, it says that it's not stated in the record, so they've probably gone back to the indents to check whether he was single or married at home. And Isabella Craggs is single, but there is a notation that on February the 18th, 1828, she was sent back to the factory, the female factory, for 3 months because she was found in bed with a man in a disorderly house. So you get these little details on these documents that you wouldn't have got any other way. Here we have an application for the bans for James Daniel, who is 30. Anne Randall is only 15 and was born in the colony, living with her mother and her father. But he is described as a bachelor, sober, honest, and attentive to his duties. However, he apparently told the minister some time ago, and others when he first came to the country, that he left a wife and 3 children in India and expected them soon to follow him. But now he says he was never married to her, and therefore he's seeking to marry Anne Randall. Tickets of leave, they're part of the incentive for good behaviour by a convict. So there was punishments, but there was also incentives. So shortening of the sentence, which is what a ticket of leave allows, it's more or less like a parole. And basically they could live in the locality they were told to live in, but they could work for themselves and they could earn money for themselves. So they're off the government books. It was introduced in 1801, helped reduce the costs because they could support themselves, and it rewarded good behaviour. So yes, you might get it for halfway through your sentence, but you could also get it for doing good deeds by the government's standards. So we've got the ticket of leave, a list of the ticket of leaves issued up to 1814, and then you've got the ticket of leave butts from 1827 to 75. So the very early records are quite minimal in the amount of information you've got. You've got Margaret Merkel, the ship she came on, the name of the master, the year she arrived, the date of the ticket, the sentence, where she now lives in Sydney, and where she was tried. So very, very basic information. Smaller population, less need to know to write down all the information that's known about them. You can get to indexes on our website via the online indexes. So you can also search under the search box. And I just want to explain some of the reasons why you might want to use the online indexes rather than just the search box. So here we've searched for George Watkins in our collection, and we're getting 214 results. We're getting probate packets, we're getting divorces, we're getting row employment cards, we're getting inquests, business and company records. We've got 65 entries in the Convict Index. Now we can certainly narrow down by using the filters. So we could actually click on the left-hand side of where it says Convict Index, put a little tick in the box and apply the filter. But you can also go to the online indexes under C for convicts, and you can then search the actual Convict Index. There are 4 indexes available on the online indexes: the early Convict Index, the Convict Assignments 1821 to 25, the Convict Exiles Index 1849 to 50, and the Convict Applications to Marry. So they're 4 separate indexes. If you went through search, you'd get all of those indexes together, but going through the actual Convict Index allows you to actually download the information into an Excel spreadsheet or another sort of data form. So here we're searching for George Watkins. Down the bottom of the page, you get the little buttons that allow you to create a copy in Excel. And here we have our copy that's been downloaded to our computer from home in Excel. And that means you can now go through, sort it in some sort of method that you want to sort it by. Say you were trying to sort it by ship name or by date, and just have a look at the kind of records that we've got. Now, if you had gone through the main catalogue through the search box, if we had digital records available, you could actually click on that person. You can tick on the filter digitally available and only see those digital records. And you can tell we've got a digital record because there's a little thumbnail image of the record showing up next to the person's name. You can then access that digital image, and this is one from the 1788 to 1825 Colonial Secretary's Papers, by clicking on the second little thumbnail. So the little thumbnail that's actually showing underneath the words Image Gallery. That will then open it up into another window. You've got the little button to enlarge it, and of course you can right-click and save as, so you can actually save a copy to your home computer. Now, you can also order a copy from us when you're in the index. So if you click on the word details, it actually takes you back to the main catalogue and it tells you all about the information, but it also gives you the little black shopping cart so that you can purchase a copy from us. Bearing in mind that you may have already seen these records digitised on Ancestry, so just check what you've seen elsewhere before you order the copy from us. Now here is an actual copy, an original of George Watkins's ticket of leave. This is actually the ticket of leave butt. Similar concept to a check butt. So the other part of the record would have been torn off and given to him to carry around, because he had to actually produce that record to show people that he was allowed to wander around in his locality and to earn his own living. And if he wasn't able to show that record, there could be serious consequences, which is why you often find references to the fact that they're issuing new ones because the first one had been destroyed or torn up or had got burnt or whatever. But lots more information on this ticket of leave than we got on the earlier one. So ship they came out on, yes, year, place of trial, date of trial, sentence. We get told that George Watkins actually got his ticket of leave, not because he was halfway through his sentence, because he only arrived, he was tried in 1828, he arrived in 1829, and it's being issued in December 31. But he actually got it because he brought to conviction persons convicted of burning his master's wheat. So he did a good deed. All sorts of little annotations. So he was previously allowed to remain in the district of Upper Hunter, and it's been altered so that he can actually remain at Patrick's Plains or Singleton. I can see the date of that, 33, I think it is. So 2 years later, he's allowed to move from Upper Hunter to Patrick's Plains. All sorts of little annotations. And if we go to the next page, because these have been written crossways. So the only one, unfortunately, you could probably still find is the Colonial Secretary's letter. So that's a letter number, 1831-31/1233, 29th of December 1831. It may in fact tell us something about the fact about the wheat burning in that letter. Other letters, unfortunately, that don't have that annotation, such as renewed and the bottom one being cancelled, the Principal Superintendent of Convict Records, and it may be that we can't find those letters, but maybe something was written to the Col Sec at the time, so always worth trying Colonial Secretary. His ticket of leave was in fact cancelled, and that's what the bottom one says, for being convicted of telling a gross falsehood to his master, Mr. Moody. In June 1835, it was cancelled. And then it was renewed in 1836. So lots of information on there that we can then try and follow up on. A certificate of freedom is the next document that we might be looking at. And basically this only applies to people who had a 7, 10 or 14-year sentence, and it says that they have finished their sentence. Now, the thing you've got to remember about certificates of freedom, they would certainly make a declaration to their local magistrate, and you could try looking at the bench books as well to see if they've survived for the local area. The magistrate would send to Sydney, and the black books and conduct records would be checked and the indents would be checked. Then the certificate would be issued, but only after the convict or the ex-convict had paid a fee. So not everybody decided they wanted to spend their money that way, and some people may not have actually applied for a certificate of freedom. The second person on this list, Mary Begley, there's a little notation over in the right-hand corner, which actually says that her certificate was renewed because she said that it had been burned. So even though she didn't actually need the certificate, in 1824, 13 years after she first received it, she wanted a copy to prove that she had finished her sentence. Certificates of freedom in the later period, again, look very similar to those of the tickets of leave. And again, you've got the butt of the certificate surviving, whereas the other part of the page would have been given to the convict, or the ex-convict, I should say. But again, lots of information. You've got ship, master, year, native place, trade or calling, what they did, where they were tried, date of trial, sentence, and of course we've got the physical description. Pardons only apply to those people who had life sentences, because life is for life. There were two types of pardons. There were the conditional pardons and there were the absolute pardons. You tend to get an absolute pardon for saving the governor's daughter or for dobbing in your mates. Most people got conditional pardons. The condition was that they couldn't return to England, and basically because life was life, that basically meant that they couldn't return to England at any stage. So again, the early records are just lists of names. In this case, we've got lots and lots of columns, and the columns aren't even filled in. So James Bloodsworth arrived on the Charlotte on the First Fleet. He had skills the colony needed. He was appointed master bricklayer, given an absolute pardon in 1791, superintendent of brickmakers and bricklayers in 1791, a landholder at Petersham, and he died in March 1804. Here we have a conditional pardon for John Cann, who arrived on the Mangles in 1837. He had stolen sheep, and was tried in 1836. Born 1807, complexion dark and freckledy, eyes grey, several small moles on neck, so on and so forth. Tried at Essex, 5 foot 5.5 inches, and hair brown. So lots of information on the later ones that you're not getting on the earlier records. I want to just talk a little bit about Colonial Secretaries, Petitions and Correspondence, because sometimes that's where the real meat is. Now, you don't always get a letter about your convict in these records. As I said, good behaved convicts rarely get extra information on them. Some of those that are badly behaved or actually want something from the government because they're basically writing to say they want something. So we have the Colonial Secretary's Papers, 1788 to 1825. And again, these are digitally available on our website and on Ancestry. There are Colonial Secretary's letters, correspondence from 1826 on, and they have contemporary indexes and registers, which you may need to use if you're doing a subject rather than a person. Then there are indexes that highlight people's names, such as the Colonial Secretary's Letters Re Land. The index is on our website. Copies of the letters themselves are on Ancestry. Published indexes to the Col Sec letters by Joan Rees, up to 1826 to 1896. These are original letters. The index has been published, and you may find it at your local library, but then you'll need to come to us to actually see the original letter. There's also an index to letters sent to the sheriff, 1828 to 1850, and there are applications to bring out wives and families. So now we have some of these examples. For example, this one is James McNulty, a servant of Matthew Bacon, and he's asking for a ticket of leave. And he's basically saying that he has been in the service of government since his arrival in the colony until May 1820. So he was doing government work. Then he was assigned off stores to Mr. Matthew Bacon of York Street, Sydney, which means the government was no longer providing his food, clothing, etc. And he's still with Mr. Bacon. And he's hoping, he trusts his conduct since his arrival will be found irreproachable, and as such to induce your excellency to grant unto your humble partitioner the indulgence of a ticket of leave. Here we have a letter from Hugh Maguire, and he's asking to be assigned to be on stores. And he's explaining why he suddenly needs to be supported by the government and given food and clothing. He arrived on the, it says the Elizabeth, and his sentence was life. But shortly after his arrival, he was appointed the overseer of Gross Farm by Commissioner Biggs. And 18 months later, he was also appointed a constable. And he did both jobs for a further 3 years. Describes himself as being active in apprehending most desperate bush rangers which had infested the neighbourhood of Liverpool. As thanks for this capturing the bush rangers, he was appointed an acting sub-inspector of all clearing parties. And again, he held this job for 3 years. He also mentions some of his previous history before he was transported. So he spent 6 years in the Inniskillen Dragoons in active service. He was in the British Army. And he was at the Battle of Waterloo and received severe wounds. Now, he's obviously been removed from his job as being sub-inspector, and that's why he's asking to be assigned from the stores, in other words, to be given food and clothing from the stores. And there's a little comment. It's always pays not just to look at the letter, but also to look at the front page of the letter. And there's a little comment saying that he was removed because he was guilty of very great irregularities. Now, I don't know whether or not what happened to him. There's 3 Hugh Maguires who were convicts, one of whom actually turned to armed robbery in 1832. So that would be a bit ironic if that was him. Occasionally in the Col Sec letters and petitions, you do get glimpses of what might have been if the Principal Superintendent of Convict Records has survived. And this is an application from George Lane applying to have John Carroll assigned to him. Carroll arrived on the Anne and Amelia. His sentence was 7 years. Lane already has 2 free servants who have been with him upwards of 13 years. And he has 2 referees, Lane does, Samuel Terry and John Cornell, saying they've known him for 10 years, that he's honest, sober and industrious, and therefore also that he can has the means to look after and support, provide the food and clothing for another servant. What I find fascinating about this is A, that it's printed. And so there are obviously so many applications for convict assignments that they have a special letter printed. Not only is it printed, but it can actually fold up so that it forms its own envelope. And on the front of the envelope, you actually have the fact that it's application for convict servants. I can kind of imagine this coming into a very busy office and them just looking at the envelope and saying, right, that goes to over there because this is actually an application and this letter has to go elsewhere. So these little glimpses of what we've lost, I don't know whether it makes me sadder or happier to see it. Death records. Now, again, we've got to remember that, in fact, these are people who died while they were still serving as convicts. The government isn't interested in what happened to convicts after they finished their sentence. So we have often been asked, people assume that this death register includes all convicts. It doesn't. It's only those who are still serving their sentences. So you've got the convict death register 1828 to 79. You've got the normal birth, death, marriages indexes, which are available on the New South Wales Birth, Death, Marriages website. You've got the TD Much Index to birth, deaths and marriages. And of course, you've got our records that we have that would normally show information on people who died, such as the probate packets, which usually includes the will, and the intestate estate case papers for some people who died without wills and who they're having difficulty tracing relatives for. So our last person on this list is Darby Quinlan. He arrived in 1824 on the Castle Forbes and was forwarded to Windsor for distribution in 1824. He received a ticket of leave in 1832 for the Windsor area, and in 1835 he was still at Windsor, and that's where he drowned. So we've had a brief look at the records that we hold here at New South Wales State Archives. But the thing that is amazing is how many more records there are now available digitally on other people's websites, and not just records relating to your convict's time in New South Wales, but particularly records relating to the British experience and the trial, and even the ship coming out, what happened on the ship coming out. So some of the things I'd like to recommend that you have a look at are the Historical Records of Australia, which is now digitally available on the National Library of Australia's Trove website. And these are governor's dispatches, official documents that have been printed. Historical Records of New South Wales, which was the first one published. It was published 1892 to 1901, and again is available on the National Library's website. Trove. What did we do before Trove came along? The digitised newspapers, the New South Wales Government Gazettes, they're particularly useful for the convict assignments, given that we've lost the Principal Superintendent of Convicts records. Australian Joint Copying Project. Now, this is records that the Australian libraries went back to England and microfilmed. And now what's happened, these microfilms have always been available. You've had to come to a library to use them. And now that they've been digitised by the National Library, and they're up on the Trove website, which means you can do these things from home. And I just want to show you an example of why you might want to do this. So here we have a letter from Historical Records of Australia, and it talks about the fact that some convicts whose sentences have expired have actually left the colony by December 1791. It also says that some of them whose sentences haven't expired were also secreted on board and carried from the settlement. Now, at the bottom of this letter, and remembering this was published in the early part of the 20th century, there's a little notation to say that the lists of names couldn't be found. So the publications were done from copies that were kept in Australia, and nobody kept a copy of that list. But if you go to the Australian Joint Copying Project, you've got the British Colonial Office records, and there is the list proving that William Ayres, and if you look up any of the First Fleet books, you'll say that it'll say that William Ayres and his wife are believed to have left the colony. Well, here's the proof that they had definitely left the colony by December 1791. I don't know where they went, but they had definitely left. There is so much more now available on Ancestry, and a lot of these are British records. Sometimes they look as though they're duplicates, but it's always worthwhile to have a look at every record and see how they differ from each other. So particularly the settlers and convict lists, which look kind of like they're musters. I'm not totally certain exactly what they've been drawn from, whether or not the British are keeping a list of all the convicts, but often they'll talk about deaths that we don't actually have in the New South Wales records. They'll talk about employment and where people are residing. The surgeons' journals for the convict ships, which are in two separate databases, the Royal Naval Medical Journals and the Surgeon Superintendent Journals. So two separate databases there depending upon the time period. But we have the original microfilms available in Australia, but the writing is often very faint. And of course, this is the Surgeon's Journal of what happened on the voyage, who was ill on the voyage, that type of thing. And of course, Ancestry also has the criminal registers for the British jails and for the hulks. Bearing in mind that Ancestry is a subscription service, but a lot of public libraries provide free access. We have free access here if you come to our reading room, and often large public libraries and state and national libraries will provide access free to their customers as well. Some of the other things that are out there on the web now, there's the State Library of Queensland's Convict Transportation Registers, which is made from microfilms from the Australian Joint Copying Project. So that's an overall index to all convicts arriving, not just in New South Wales. You've also got the National Archives of Ireland's penal transportation records. You can look up the index there, and we have the microfilms here if you then want to see that actual document. Daily online, Proceedings of the Old Bailey 1674 to 1913. And again, you get the full copy of the record. The Digital Panopticon, which has marvellous amounts of information, not just databases. You can actually create graphs about things. It has a database of 58,000 convict tattoos, so you can search for specific tattoos. It has lots of background information about the actual convict process, all sorts of information that you might like to read to fill in the background, those missing answers that you're not able to find in our records. And lastly, but not least, we have the British Parliamentary Papers, because they actually published copies of letters, reports, that sort of thing. These are available on Proquest by the State Library of New South Wales. You just need your library card. People often ask us how convict wives, the wives of convicts, got to Australia. And here's an answer to part of that. It's a letter, 24th of December 1789, from Secretary Grenville to Governor Phillip. And in that early period, wives of convicts often came out on board the same ships as their husbands. And Grenville is stating the number of female convicts bearing a great disproportion to that of males. It was thought advisable that such of the latter as were married should be allowed to take their wives with them on board the ships in which they had embarked, or even women who cohabitated with them. Unfortunately, very few were prevailed upon to accede to the proposal. Now, the interesting thing is, if you look at the names of the ships, Neptune, Scarborough and Surprise, this is the notorious Second Fleet. A quarter of the convicts died on this voyage, and another 40% died within 6 months of arrival. I can't help but wonder if the wives survived. And if they did die, were their deaths even recorded? Because they're certainly not going to be listed on the Convict Indent. So another one of our unanswered questions. So before I wrap up, I just want to recap and say some of the things that I hope that you will take away with you from this talk. Firstly, that we have a wealth of information about convicts, but the best records are about the major events in that convict's journey. The arrival, the ticket of leave, the permission to marry if still convict, the death if still convict, the certificate of freedom or the pardon. They don't provide that day-to-day activity detail due to the 1863 and the 1870 destructions of records. But just remember that the better behaved convicts, the fewer the records. The worst behaved convicts may not only get letters to the Col Sec written about them, but they also feature in court, jail records. What's in the records changes over time. as the colony's population grows and you get more free people, you get people who are freed by servitude, they've finished their sentence, and then you've got the convicts. And also the borders push further out. So there's a need for information to be in the outer areas and not just centred in Sydney. So you start to get more detailed information about the convicts that you just don't get in that early period. So to answer some of your questions, you may in fact need to read about the system, the convict system generally, and that may provide you with the kind of background you need, even if not the specific answers. So Charles Bateson's Convict Ships book, for example, Historical Records of New South Wales, Historical Records of Australia. There's a wealth of books on the convict system. There's even general books such as the Cambridge Economic History of Australia that feature paragraphs, that feature chapters on it. And they may, if you're wanting to know what your convict wore, what he ate, what he did, that sort of thing, they may provide some general answers, not necessarily saying your convict did exactly this, but this is what the convicts ate, this is what the convicts wore, this is what the convicts, how the convicts lived, and so on and so forth. But some questions may never be answered. There doesn't seem to have been any, and I'd be happy to be corrected on this, there doesn't seem to be any need for people who had convicts assigned to them to actually report back to the authorities on their convict's behaviour or what the kind of work their convict was doing, or how it's only really the convicts that misbehave, and then they get sent back, and then suddenly you get some sort of record.